Everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today, we are lucky to have Tom Morgan visiting us. Tom is a former Wall Street managing director turned curiosity Sherpa and has founded the Leading Edge, a network for personal evolution, whose mission is to reveal fresh new paths, ideas, and practices in pursuit of said personal evolution. And Tom has this excellent series at the Leading Edge called Accelerating Wisdom. It's an 8-part series that just concluded. It was 10 years in the making and is a synthesis of all these transformational ideas and practices that represent the leading edge. So I invited Tom to the Stoa to discuss the series and how today is going to work. He's going to present, share some slides, and then I'll ask him some questions, and we'll pivot to a Q&A. So how it works at the Stoa, if you have questions anytime, pop them in the chat and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself, ask your question to Tom during the Q&A portion. So that being said, Tom, I'm going to take you in and welcome to the Stoa.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me, Peter. I'm looking down the list of attendees. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces here. Thanks for the guys from the Leading Edge that joined. As a result, I'm going to be in a bit of a bind, which is that I think probably half of you know who I am and what I'm talking about, and the other half of you probably have no idea who I am. And so I'm going to rattle through a presentation that I actually just did for an investment bank, which maybe shows you my incoming audience, where I set up the thesis that I have, and then I'm going to end in what came out of the Accelerating Wisdom series that I've been working on for most of this year. And then I think we can just go straight into Q&A. I'm going to highlight some places I want people to challenge me, and I want people to kind of steel man the opposition to these ideas, and then we can take it from there. So Peter, I'm going to try and share my screen. Can you guys see that? Yeah, sweet. They always say never start a presentation by making the audience do any work. And they also say never make a slide that's a huge wall of text. So here I'm making you do some work and also a huge wall of text. X is the best predictor of life satisfaction in both men and women and can offset the influence of negative age on life satisfaction. X has a greater influence on life satisfaction in older adulthood than health, socioeconomic status, financial situation, environment, or social engagement. So everything. 30 years of X research has shown that it correlates with hedonic well-being, basically how good you feel, and eudaimonic well-being, how much you're growing. Does anyone know what X is? Gonna guess, given the title and the words coming up a lot, it's wisdom, which is an achingly pretentious word because no one really wants to talk about wisdom and no one wants to imply by talking about wisdom that they themselves are wise. So what is wisdom? There's a million different definitions I've read in the literature. I put it knowing what to do and when. Knowing what to do and when. Because what's the opposite of wisdom? Anxiety. Not knowing the difference between what you want to control and what you can control. The idea of burning lots of energy with redundant activity and redundant mental energy. Whereas wisdom is like, okay, I know exactly what's relevant and I know exactly about my ability to influence that thing. And when you think about if you could go through life that way, like almost like a Taoist sage, knowing exactly what to pay attention to and when, you can immediately see how this is just tied up intrinsically into flourishing. And the weirdest part of it, and there are many weird parts, we worship IQ intelligence. It's heritable and rigid. From what I've understood from some stuff I've read, it possibly even peaks in your 20s. Wisdom has no upper limits. It's the pursuit of wisdom. You can't say I'm a 7 out of 10 wise. So why aren't we talking about it, let alone pursuing it? And part of the funnest, last few months has been that, like, I go out to investment banks and hedge funds and I talk about this and I'm like, so what are you guys doing about it? And they're like, like training, like you just get garbled answers. But even when you talk to most other people about it, there's no good answers. This is when I go back into my shtick of the public domain stuff I'm best known for. So I'm going to skip over this really quickly. But for those of you who aren't aware, I'm borderline dangerously obsessed with Ian McGilchrist, the Scottish polymath who wrote what I think is the best book I've ever read, The Matter with Things. The focus of his research is the 2 hemispheres of the brain. There's abundant research on that. The brain hemisphere stuff you've heard through the last 3-4 decades of our lives is isn't sufficiently nuanced. The nuance from McGilchrist's work is that both sides of the brain can do the same thing. They just do them in very different ways. The right hemisphere sees the whole picture, has very little use of language, it's emotional and it's intuitive. The left hemisphere is narrowly focused, uses language, it's linear and it's logical. His thesis is that we're imbalanced towards the brain's left hemisphere. Now, for those of you who are Metacrisis aficionados, which I imagine is probably everyone on this call, there is no part of the Metacrisis I can find that isn't at least partially defined by disconnection. We've destroyed 70% of the living species on Earth in the last 50 years. Why? Why? Because we've regarded ourselves as fundamentally separate from our environment. That seems like a bad idea. Why are we killing everyone with the food industrial complex? Why are we poisoning the brains of our kids through social media? Why are we voluntarily disconnecting ourselves from the environment through social media and all these other mechanisms? Why do the structure of our own cities look grid-like and linear and divorced from nature? I find part of the reason why I find the Gilchrist diagnosis so compelling is I just see evidence for it everywhere around me. My favorite example, and many of you have heard this before, is Mao's Smash Sparrows campaign, where he saw sparrows eating the grain reserves, so he instructed the population to kill all the sparrows. As a result, there was a locust infestation that killed 50 million people. This is the kind of intervention that the left hemisphere deals in, where it's like, here's something I want, here's the variable I want to change, and here's the result I expect. And suddenly everything else blows up around you because it makes interventions in complex adaptive systems that it doesn't understand. And it's very easy to laugh at Mao grimly, but actually look at engagement algorithms, look at palatability scientists in the food industrial complex, look at the desire to make quarterly earnings that I saw over and over again in Wall Street. We make the single point of intervention mistake almost constantly, and we actually do it in our own lives when we chase an abstract variable to the exclusion of everything else. I know that because I did it. I'm not preaching. The most powerful single study that I think McGilchrist references is this. If you experimentally suppress the left hemisphere of a normal subject for 10 to 15 minutes, people start to see the world as animate, the sun going across the sky, giving them energy. And I don't know how many of you guys listen to Josh Schrei's Emerald, but he made a wonderful podcast where he's like, 99% of humanity has regarded the world as animate. And whenever Western materialism discovered that worldview, it assumed that the 99% was wrong and not them. That most indigenous cultures, in fact, most other cultures prior to modernity, regarded themselves as intrinsically embedded in their environment. In contrast, if you suppress the brain's right hemisphere, people start to see the person opposite them as zombies, machinery, or dead. And that kind of sociopathic detachment I saw on Wall Street when there were 26 rounds of layoffs in my 4.5 years, because people were just numbers. It was head count. It wasn't an individual person. And that dynamic of total detachment and sociopathy and psychopathy is something that I think about a lot when it comes to how I see people behaving in late stage capitalism. What are we disconnected from? This is the other half of the two ideas that have changed my life. The first is that we're left brain locked, diagnosis. The second is what are we disconnected from? The thinnest end of the wedge that I found for people to explain this is curiosity, which dictionary definition, a strong desire to know or learn something, which is a definition that tells you nothing. And this is the question that changed my life. Of all people, I was listening to a Jordan Peterson podcast in 2017, where I regarded him as at a better stage of his personal evolution. And he talked about an idea from Carl Jung where what interested you in the present was a guide of your future growth from your soul. And that idea stuck with me and hasn't stopped sticking with me since. That if you want to slowly blow someone's brain open to these ideas, you say, can you force yourself to be interested in something? And everyone intrinsically knows that they can't. They can force themselves to do something. But if I say to you, you have to spend the rest of your life as an accountant or actuary, or you get to spend the rest of your life exploring a topic that's intrinsically interesting to you, you understand immediately that you're not dealing with something that you're in full control of. So that opens up this idea space to what is actually controlling your attention. This is an idea that I've been circling around for a number of years now, with help from the guys in the, I guess the meta-modern community, Bobby Azarian, Brett Anderson, Brendan Graham Dempsey. The evolution trends towards complexity. That look outside. That we've gone from rocks to the internet in a vanishingly short period of time, and actually things are getting more complex at an accelerating rate. The definition of complexity is both highly differentiated and highly integrated. This is really unwieldy, and anyone that has a better metaphor for it, please tell me. But essentially, the human body, Well, actually, let's start from an economic perspective. A not differentiated economy is a commodity exporter. When the copper market goes down, they're screwed. A not integrated economy is a bazaar full of 1,000 different businesses, but no integrated supply chain. A complex economy, and one that's theoretically dynamic, like modern capitalism, is where you have all of these industries seamlessly, integrated. The whole meme about where does your pencil come from? If you look at a pencil, how many different supply chains and parts of expertise came together to make that thing possible? But I also like the human body. If we weren't integrated, we'd be a sludge on the floor of all the bajillion different parts of your body. And if we weren't differentiated, we'd be one cell and we wouldn't be humanity. As I'm talking to you right now, you're aware of your big toe. Well, you probably are now. You're not performing your digestion. You're not actively respirating. We are one of the most differentiated and integrated entities in the known universe. In fact, the human brain is the most complex thing in the known universe. So like that is what complexity is. Now, I think a lot of people assume that dynamic terminates at us, that because we're the apex of this process, those same rules don't apply to us. I've become very enamored with this idea that came out of Ervin Laszlo. I interviewed him a few weeks ago, called the holotropic attractor, where he says the attractor that biases interactions in the universe is wholeness oriented. It is a holotropic attractor. It need not be a separate additional law of nature. It could be, and most plausibly is, the emergent effect of the known laws. There's this stat that the odds of all of us being here listening to this right now, from a complexity perspective, are the same as a hurricane sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a working 747. To which the rationalist response is there are an infinite number of worlds. It had to happen here. The other theory that I've encountered recently that I think is worth digging into is syntropy, most popularized by a gentleman called Ulysses de Corpo. I interviewed him a few weeks ago, and he makes really quite a compelling argument that you have entropy, things fall apart, obvious, but you also have syntropy, a symmetrical force of complexification, which operates like life force, like energy, and he thinks it operates from the future through what we're attracted to, and that operates through our heart centers. So you have this idea that comes out of it that like people who are more curious live longer. That is actually backed up by a study. You have the idea that thermodynamically you are dying all the time, so you should pursue what excites you. Like literally think of the word excites you. When you pursue what excites you and what evolves you into your niche, you are extracting energy from your environment. We think about it in food. We think about it in terms of romantic partners. Do we think about it in terms of the information that we consciously pursue? There's also a good reason for this. Trial and error wouldn't have worked. The world is what John Bevacqua calls combinatorially explosive. There's too many options and too little time. There has to be a force narrowing our interests in the environment. And how do you know you found integration? My favorite quote from Joseph Campbell: folly or bliss, and doors will open where you didn't know where they were going to be. There has to be an environmental response if indeed we inhabit an intelligent environment. That is probably the ultimate question from this talk. Your niche needs to love you back. Curiosity is a relational force. You cannot control what you're interested in. John Bevacqua gives this example of whether a great white shark is fitted to its niche. Well, if it's in the Sahara Desert, it dies in 5 minutes, right? And if it's in the sea, it's incredibly fitted to its niche. Are you fitted to your niche in terms of what you're doing with your life? Does your niche love you back? Are you trying to grind yourself up against a place where you shouldn't be? This happened to me when I lost interest of my job in Wall Street. It happens to a lot of people in midlife when they have to pivot to a different niche, which they've lost interest in. They are no longer fitted to that niche, and that niche starts actively ejecting them. So differentiation, when you're pursuing your own niche, curiosity, it feels meaningful, it puts you in flow. If you're embodied, if you're a little bit aware of what gets you interested, that is relatively intuitive. The integration, environmental feedback is positive. I tend to look at this in the way of synchronicities, which is if you are pursuing the right path of differentiation, you will see a cluster of synchronicities or simply positive feedback. You will get more clicks, you will get more money, things will go well, you will get abundance. The Taoists understood this, which I always find a touch embarrassing, given how long ago they were writing. There is a deeper reality, a flow that we do not control, but we can harmonize with, and things go unbelievably well in a completely unanticipated way when we do it. But it's paradoxical. This is why Taoism is so paradoxical, that you are surrendering your left hemispheric narrow agency to the right hemisphere, which is somatic and energetic, and I think most importantly for most people, non-verbal. It is typically for most people not the voice in their heads. So when I gone through this presentation a bunch of times, and what's new in the last, I'd say, few months is that one of the common criticisms of McGilchrist is he doesn't really say much about how you go about addressing this imbalance in our brains. He probably just doesn't want to. River Kenner, who I don't know if you guys have run into, but I think he's one of the freshest voices on the internet. He's written a lot about this and has done a really good article called Solving McGilchrist's Big Problem. He was a guest for my series episode 3 to talk about different wisdom practices. But the way I like to broadly frame this is wisdom, knowing what to pay attention to and when. Again, it's a bit like this concept from John Vervaeke of relevance realization. It's the right hemisphere that tells you what to pay attention to and when, so that the left hemisphere can act on it in an egoic sense, which means you need to be looking at ways of upregulating everything that's on the right-hand side: broad focus, nonverbal, emotional, intuitive, embodied, energetic, imaginative, and connected. These are all things that the moment you start talking about them, particularly in a rationalist audience, you get a kind of Westworld stare quite quickly. You know, like I had this dream that I'm going to go into hedge funds and start talking about dream work. You know, you even bring up somatic meditation with people, you can already feel them drifting away a little bit. But I feel that this is actually the future. One of the things that I've tried to get people to embrace a lot more is this idea of emotional granularity, where you know, balancing the hemispheres is about having a large number of ways to close feedback loops coming from your unconscious. And Eugene Gendlin's work in focusing showed that they could show within one therapy session whether people were ever going to get out. And it was based on the granularity with which they could describe their own inner state. So it's not about wholesale going over to the right-hand side. It's about how effectively do your hemispheres work together. And I think emotional granularity is quite a clever way of thinking about it. That, like, if you have 2 words for your emotions, you can't determine what's coming in your unconscious whatsoever. You can't determine what's coming in through your intuition whatsoever. If you have 1,000 words for your emotions, you can react to those stimuli much more effectively. And out of the wisdom series, I had 11 different things that came out, and I actually published a piece yesterday on this. I'm not going to go through all of them one by one, but there's a piece I'm writing that I'm going to publish in a couple of days, which kind of hopefully brings this all home, which is that I reflected on the whole series for several months, and I was like, what did I learn incrementally from talking to 8 world-class experts about how to get more right hemispheric? And there was one word that dropped out at the bottom, and it was subtle, which ironically wasn't the word I was expecting. That there's a great story about this guy, Frank Mourier, who's a horse trainer, who retired from horse training to start working with the bookies. And he would watch a horse warm up for 2 to 3 minutes and then give better odds than the bookies, because he noticed subtle differences that years of training had allowed him to notice. But when he tried to put a system around it, or even explain how he was doing it, it made it worse. And then you also have this concept of, why do we bother with meditation? Why do we bother with breath work? Why do we bother with cleaning up our diet? Any of these things is effectively to give us access to very subtle signals. Ervin Laszlo describes the holotropic attractor as a subtle spiritual insight. The right hemisphere is fundamentally subtle. It is energetic. And all of these wisdom practices, as simple as literally keeping an energy journal, what raises or lowers your energy over the course of a given day. It's about tuning into this very subtle frequency, because what, you know, one of the overriding takeaways from this from this series has been is that the outside world might actually have more intelligence than you. The outside world might be guiding you as part of a complex adaptive system, but it's non-verbal, emotional, and somatic. And if you're not attuned to those signals, particularly because modernity tries to crush them, particularly because the voice in your head tries to crush them, scientific skepticism tries to crush them, you are going to miss that subtlety, and therefore you're going to miss those cues, and therefore you're going to end up going down the wrong rabbit hole. The last thing I'll say, and maybe we can go into this in the Q&A, is that the other thing that's come out of this whole work for me very, very abundantly is that it's quite left hemispheric to look at these right hemispheric practices and be like, all right, which one can I extract from context and lineage and utilize to make me more right hemispheric? And, you know, even meditation and breath work can be really dangerous. It's not something people like talking about very much. Josh Schreiber from the Emerald did a piece on guardianship a couple of weeks ago, and then he did one, I think, yesterday on meditation and mindfulness and it not being sufficient. That one of the biggest missing ingredients in today's culture is a supportive and loving community that can guide you through these processes, but also keep you in check and keep this ecology going. Vervaeke talks about an ecology of practices, this mutual and dynamic set of processes. For him, it's embodied, contemplative, and meditative. which is Tai Chi, Vipassana, and Metta, I think are his three ones. You have to have this dynamic series of practices that you participate with in a community that can tell you what's effective, that can tell you what you're doing wrong. And we seem to have almost completely eliminated that from the information landscape at the moment. But the exceptionally positive aspect of this, I believe, is that it's actually quite easy to form digital communities. Like I'm in one right now that Peter has kindly invited me to. And I think one of the futures that we can look towards is these different communities comprising increasingly agentic people, to be quite honest. The leading edge is more than 50% current or ex Wall Street people, which I think is unusual to the point of unique. And I'd like to know if it's not unique so I can speak to the other communities. So we're getting agentic communities, which throws up its own issues, but we're also getting these communities talking to each other. And that fills me with enormous amounts of optimism, because wisdom communities appear to be this transitional phase that we need to get us out of these multipolar traps we have in late stage capitalism. So I know that was a lot of information. I've tried to cover it all as quickly as possible to respect your time, but Peter, let's throw it open.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Let's give Tom a round of applause. Excellent presentation. Yeah, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. Just put question and I'll call on you in a moment. I'm going to warm up Tom with some questions. Just stuff at my edge, maybe, because as you know, I've been thinking a lot about wisdom and practices that correspond with it. Yeah, the first thing, agentic communities. Like, what makes someone wisely agentic and someone foolishly agentic? And I guess the through line there is like, what is agency if you can be wisely agentic and foolishly agentic?
I'm not sure I'm not foolishly agentic, but I think you can actually use McGilchrist framing again, which is, there's two fundamental myths. There's the hero's journey, which is how do you go through this death and rebirth phase so that you can align with attractors and even believe that attractors exist, right? And then the other myth is be careful what you wish for, which is where the ego makes the choice. And the ego usually picks a destination. Carl Jung's Red Book, completely incomprehensible to me, I'll be honest. But the one idea that came out of it was the idea that you can't be your own charioteer. The odds that your destination 3 years from now are the right one, infinitesimally small. And if you hold too tightly to your goals, you're going to, in his words, create a constant present, that you only know what you know right now. And so you'll bat away every single idea because it doesn't fit your conformity of being a millionaire by 35. We all intuitively know that's wrong, but actually living in a state where we only work one step at a time is very, very difficult in practice. I do it right now, but only because I've set up my life to accommodate that modality. So I think that we were discussing this today, actually, in the community, where it's like, where's this coming from? Is this coming from a desire for power or manipulation? Or is this surrendering to a force that's coming through me that's driven by love, as cheesy as that sounds? I think once you get better at making an embodied decision around that and sense checking it with people in your community you can trust, your ability to make agentic decisions gets better. I hope that makes sense.
And the related question I have is, I think one of the key kind of concepts of your work is the attractor, getting kind of plugged into the attractor states. And the way you describe it, I felt most like riding that wave when I created the Stoa during the start of the pandemic in 2020, as I mentioned to you. And I wasn't even thinking, it was a goalless state, really. It wasn't without its difficulties, but it was, just moving and just saying yes and to the moment, or both end. But yeah, at my edge right now is like, sometimes it seems like some life domains is like having just a concrete goal is just quite good, whether it's finances or fitness, that an objective that's like, you can achieve, and that it has best practices associated with it. And so I'm curious where you're at with that. Do you think some aspects of life, like just a traditional goal setting, is more appropriate, and other aspects, like the more deeper aspects, the attractor state is the better way to approach it?
Funny enough, I'm really glad Alex is here today, because we were talking about this previously, and another member of my community actually this week we're talking about this. But it's I presume most of you guys are familiar with the concept of fitness landscapes, right? Where it's like, in a fitness landscape, you have this undulating ocean of species and the environment evolving with you and against you, so that it's not a static fitness peak and slope and basin and yada yada yada. But I like to think of it as a boat on an ocean, and you can try and climb local fitness peaks with, like, I have basic needs, right? Like, I am trying to get to a certain income level through the leading edge that can cover my costs, that sort of thing, right? Like, to say that you don't go through life with those individual goals is dumb. I regard those as very consciously using my left hemisphere trying to climb up a peak or a wave, right? The way I think about the attractor, the holotropic attractor, as distinct from other attractors, people talk about attractor basins, right? I think about the holotropic attractor as something that exists outside the landscape, as something that helps you wayfind through the sea. That effectively you can go through the little peaks and troughs that are part of the landscape, but there's something outside of the system that means that if that environment changes on you, or you get to a local optima, or you end up in a basin, there's something that can pull you out of that stuck point. But you have to be dynamic enough to realize what it is. And that attractor is love, which again is the worst word on earth for what I'm talking about because it sounds so cheesy. But like, if you get stuck in a basin, right, you need a form of energy to pull you out of that attractor basin. That is what that love is. That is what that excitement is. That is what that curiosity is. So it's not that you don't have individual goals, because I don't think anyone lives that way. I think it's sort of this ability to pivot in the moment when the energy goes bad, right? Either you're at the top of a local fitness peak and you're looping, or you're in a like a mega depressed basin and you need to get out of that. It's the attractor that exists outside of the paradigm, probably beyond time and space, that can help you in that situation. As well as that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a sort of a lot of rich material can come from this. It's like having that attractor goal match and being ready to do goal adjustment when the tractor is pointing you somewhere else. And then when you have that like a attractor goal gap, when you're like kind of fixated on that goal and it's no longer kind of has that energy imbued in it. Um, yeah, it's kind of like the art form becomes when to pivot. And perhaps this is a practice that could help with it. And this wasn't one of the practices that were mentioned in your latest one, so I wanted to ask you about it. Is basically inquiry, or what John would call like dialogos. Um, like philosophy, the love of wisdom. The basis is philosophical inquiry, but most like academic or para-academic philosophy is like highly theoretical and not really plugged into the wisdom kind of tech. But at the basis of John's work and Jill Nephew's work is inquiry, a philosophical inquiry. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that and how that's related to wisdom in these attractor states.
I think it's about the ability to give and receive love. That effectively, if you cannot receive love, particularly, which I think is really difficult, particularly for men in today's world, and certainly for me, if you cannot receive love, you cannot get accurate cues when you need to pivot. And the reason why that relates to philosophia, love of wisdom, and the concept of wisdom in general, is that in this attractor framing, wisdom exists as a relational force, right? Wisdom exists as something you can connect to. We think of philosophy as like, let's play some word games about what the meaning of is. That's getting lost in another abstraction, and that's really dangerous. And it was actually what my undergraduate degree was, and it was really, really boring at the time, right? This is about how do I connect and relate. And I think doing that in dialogos is one way of doing it, like trying to find a really loving container for stuff to come out in, but also getting your shit out where like it's very, very hard to do. I've got a talk coming up with a guy called Brian Wetton. That's the most insight-dense conversation I've probably ever had. I can't wait to share it with you guys. I'm actually releasing it in 2 parts because it's so dense. But he introduced me to this idea of container size. That effectively, when you're talking to someone that is more aware than you, they can hold greater space for you and they can reflect your shadow back to you, which might then trigger you and then allows you to clear that shadow and then become a larger container yourself. So as you get more aware, your container gets larger, but it also gets cleaner and therefore can hold more power, hold more energy. That process, I think, allows you to get functionally wiser, but also to navigate better. So this is just a really super long-winded way of saying yes, 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 yes. That dialogos, I think, needs to be safe and loving. Otherwise, when that material comes out, it either won't come out, or it won't come out in the right way, or people will just talk past each other. But also, relationship, it's not just relationship between you and me, it's relationship between me and my environment. And that's something that most people don't believe because they can't feel. And I guess the final thing I'll say, because I think this is probably the biggest question in my life, and it's certainly the most alive for me right now, which is that in terms of relational forces, if people believed that once they had found that niche, once they had got access to that attractor, their life choices would be supported through mysterious abundance, that actually, like, the ability to follow your bliss wasn't just restricted to the top of Maslow's hierarchy, that God or the system was intelligent enough to facilitate the creation of the Stoa, despite the fact you didn't have the money or resources for it, or whatever it is. That would reconfigure society immediately. And so you have to say, is God or capitalism smarter, right? Is the attractor or capitalism smarter? Does Moloch break this idea? And the idea is, if you come around to the view that the attractive forces that we're talking about are more powerful and more intelligent than capitalism, people start to have to ask themselves very powerful and very awkward questions about how they're spending their life. No, that wasn't what you asked about, but it just came up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. A thought emerged from listening to is that I have an inquiry practice, and when you're engaging in good inquiry, you get to the state of aporia where you're just like, whoa, like what's going on? And it's like you just plug into the mystery, and what you thought you once knew, you realize you don't know. Um, and yeah, the condition of love, because it's kind of dangerous and super vulnerable being in that state, because your whole world can kind of just turn upside down. And so if someone's holding space for you with love and you can feel it, like where the therapist called unconditional positive guard or whatever, but if it's genuine, then it provides that kind of safe container for a general, and then that kind of bridges the gap between the attractor and the goal. I'll have one more question, and if you have any questions, pop your hand up or put it in the chat, and I'll call on you in a moment. So another theme I've been thinking about lately related to wisdom is power or politics, the exercise of power. And the rationalists, they call like politics is the mind killer, and maybe we can say politics is the attractor killer as well. But if theoretically, if we become more wise, the accumulation of power will just be granted, I would imagine. Whether it's like a conscious pursuit or not. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the relationship with wisdom and power, and how to hold power wisely.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, because my genre has basically been stuck powerful people. And I think that kind of gives you your answer, which is that I'm not aware of many situations where people just spontaneously decide to pivot to a more holistic way of acting. People who are winning the success game, as they framed it, don't usually walk away until they've hit a point where they've hit the wall. And you wish it could be otherwise. But like, you have the people who are climbing success mountain, and I think that looks different for a lot of different people. But often, the more left brain locked you are, the higher up the mountain you can climb from a success and power perspective. And then once you get to the top and you look around, and often you like, there's a cliche that's like, oh my God, I wasted my whole life. It's like, no, like, all of these people are really happy with the things that they got. They just can't work out why things suddenly went stale for them, or why they feel ashamed because they don't have these things. And then they need to pivot from this left hemisphere mode of being to this right hemisphere mode of being. And everyone's like fundamentally untrained for that, which is great. It's why I now have this project. It's why I now have this community. The degree of death and rebirth required, don't know. The degree of suffering required, don't know. The degree of individual wisdom practice required, don't know. It seems to be different for everyone. My concern is that basically, does society have to hit a wall in aggregate like the individual has to before we can change? It's something that's been very alive for me recently. I'm going to share it with you guys, but I've had a bonkers number of people in like the psychic, intuitive, indigenous elders world come to me over the last, say, 6 months and say we're 2 years from a systemic event. As someone from Wall Street, negative predictions always get like 2 raised eyebrows from me. But I think that that's helping focus the mind of some of the very, very hyper agent like people I know. some of them are like, shit, I need a bigger bunker. Shit, I need bomb collars for my private security. But I think a lot of them are increasingly understanding that I don't like the term raising of consciousness, but the integrating of consciousness now actually might be existentially important. In sort of the Hawkins idea that like, or the Wilbur idea that like you're not going to make it if you're still operating at the wrong level of consciousness. And something I think about all the time is, this idea that if you're still holding to this very zero-sum mentality, you're going to go slowly insane. And I think the number of people that are hitting walls recently, psychologically, maybe it's an indication that we're all canaries in the coal mine, and the more sensitive people went first. And I feel good about that, but I feel bad about the fact, to answer your question, that most people don't pivot until they've hit that wall. Because why would they?
Mhm. All right. Cool. I'm all jazzed up, but we'll pivot to Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, pop in the chat. I'll call on you. We got a hand up, Brett Minster. Feel free to ask your question and one follow-up.
Thank you, Peter, for hosting. Thank you for allowing me to chime in real quick. Um, I feel just really called to take the opportunity to say thank you, Tom. I love you, man. Your work inspires me. So crystal clear today and enjoyable. And thank you for being curious, man. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I loved it. I've dropped a definition of syntropy in there that Barbara Marx Hubbard used specifically. She was good friends with Irvin. So you might want to take a look at that definition because they were quite close in their understanding of conscious evolution and co-creation and the physics as above, so below. Irvin would talk more about that in a sense. But that was the first word that came to me when you said if you found a better word than complexity. So it's not a better word, but I find this definition of syntropy to actually be a more comprehensively robust sort of feeling I get. Of course, you have to know the jargon to put all the pieces together. So you're preaching to the choir there. But yeah, take a look at that definition. And again, I think I've mentioned to you before, Donald Hoffman's work. I'm not a mathematician or physicist by trade, but my profiteering curiosity, intuition that is always right in that sort of archetypal way tells me like his work is mathematically talking about the realm beyond space-time where there is syntropy, where there is no scarcity because it's the wholeness, the oneness, and that basically when we project into having an experience and metacognizing and rationalizing things and carving the infinite up with the left brain, that's when entropy comes into the picture because there's a loss of information from the pureness of the Zen state to the map that we then describe that territory. And in that transition, like informationally, mathematically, physics wise, that's where the entropy happens. So I really think you should talk to him at some point and like even have him and Irvin and have some of the cross disciplinary. That would be awesome. Thank you, Peter. Thank for letting me say thank you because I really celebrate you, Tom, man. Thank you.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. That means a lot to me. And yeah, as I said at the start, like I've had people get a little pissy about Laszlo's work on the holotropic attractor. I had someone really push back on De Corpo's work on syntropy. I interviewed, as I said, like I've interviewed them both in the last couple of months and found them really compelling, but I don't have the bona fides to be like their interpretation of quantum mechanics is wrong. Like, and this is where I get over my skis. I can tell they're directionally right. I can tell that they're directionally right. And the problem with all of this is like, what's the minimum viable science that coats the pill? But also like, what's enough for me to understand? Like, I've been approached to write a book about this, and like, I'm like, how much evidence do I need to provide from a scientific perspective to at least pry people open? And actually, Donald Hoffman was a gateway drug for me too, Brett, because he introduced me to the idea of the Umwelt, where basically, he says that basically all of reality is a desktop interface, and what's actually the reality is your computer, or in fact the internet, that you can't see and you're never going to see because it wasn't evolutionarily important for you to see. That opened me to this idea that if that's true, that we haven't evolved to see everything, which is just like obvious, then there must be forces beyond our Umwelt that influence us. Like the odds that aren't the case are infinitesimally small. So the moment you like posit that, you're like, okay, I'm not witnessing everything there is to witness because otherwise I'd go insane. What is the probability that stuff outside my own belt isn't exerting an influence on me? Zero. like close to zero, right? So what is that thing, right? Like, what is that thing? And for me, that was the gateway drug to the idea of an attractor. But even then, I'm like, people are like, is there one attractor? Are there multiple attractors? And I had to stop and think about that, which I'm like, no, there's probably like a bunch of like things that work as attractors in your life, and that's cool. Like, your wife, right? Like your husband. There's also this idea of like the attractor, the whole of consciousness and reality is moving in one direction that kind of confusingly draws you into a specific niche. But there's one thing that interacts on us like one way, and that's the thing we need to align with. And I think that's closer to the way that I understand the world. And like you have this smattering in this mosaic, and I guess no one's going to have the whole elephant, right? But you have Taoism, and you have De Corpo, and you have Laszlo, and like to this group, I'm always looking for more things. I'm going to dig. Thank you, Brett. I'm going to dig back into Hoffman because I've never quite understood all of it. Thank you.
All right, Walker, we'll go with your question next.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for being here. I kind of am on my anti-internet community bend right now, that it doesn't offer sufficient solutions, and that we're all kind of spinning a wheel. So yeah, I was wondering if we can define entropy as these forces that isolate us, remove us from reality, reduce our well-being, what does the actual centropic force look like? And I know raising agency, being together with like-minded individuals helps, but it seems insufficient, you know?
Dude, totally. I'm getting really cynical about it. Like I joined a lot of communities before I started my community, and there's a strong masturbatory tendency to invent new languages and then write 10,000 word papers on AI safety, despite the fact that you know no one in Silicon Valley, and people talking about and dealing with systemic issues that they themselves cannot control and will never control before doing any work on themselves. And I'm not saying I'm beyond any of those things, right? Like I'm totally at risk of all those things. So what I've done instead is like I saw a very specific problem, which was men on Wall Street getting stuck. And 30% of my community is women, thank God. But like that seemed to be the niche that I attracted. And these guys got absolutely no form of compassion whatsoever because people were like Wall Street, wealthy, Crimea River. And I'm like, well, great, these people are actually killing themselves. And if you think that they're useful individuals, maybe they should be contributing to society in different ways, but they don't have a space where they can do that. So I was like, I'm going to create that space for better or for worse, where people can explore individual personal development practices with other people. The kind of stuff that I was talking about at the end of that presentation, where it's like, can I work on myself? With a group of people who are also agentic, therefore will help me understand that there's science behind this, that other people have this problem. And for me, that if one person finds their niche, and that niche, because these people are already very powerful left hemispheric people that have a lot of money, the disproportionate butterfly effect that comes out of that is very, very powerful. But just yesterday, right, like two members of our community, Mona Sabani and Alison Paradise, they're both pioneers in the field of bringing these kinds of fringe consciousness ideas to the scientific community. Our community in an afternoon raised a bunch of money for them to help their symposium in Chicago on Saturday, right? Like, I don't know how much that happens in other communities, and frankly, I don't care because it's happening in my community right now. That basically we're like, all right, how much money can we raise for this? A bunch of indigenous elders came to me to help make a documentary about the unfolding prophecy that we're all going to die, right? And we managed to raise a bunch of money for that documentary over a very short space of time. So like, I don't want to become a capital allocator, but the idea that we when we combine highly agentic people with individual projects, but mostly the individual projectors themselves. It's not perfect, but it's better than anything I was doing. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But it sounds like still there's this localized level of the action itself. Like you might be gathering the troops online, but then you actually have to go out into the world. And that's where I see this divorce between, like, there's a lot of people that are talking about right brain things or what have you, but it's still in this removed reality. And it's almost, mental masturbation. Yeah, I mean, so I guess my follow-up would be, how do you just follow the love, the curiosity at your local level? And how might you take the next step after that?
I have zero confidence that humanity can find a superior systemic intervention beyond capitalism. Capitalism is aggregated human intelligence, and it's been incredible, but it's also amplified and exacerbated our shadow. And I'm like, anyone here familiar with Pol Pot's Cambodia? Anyone here ever heard of Jonestown? The moment we create utopias, everyone dies, right? And I have zero confidence that even the most intelligent, in fact, particularly the most intelligent people in the world, can come up with a superior systemic intervention that doesn't get everyone killed in a really short space of time. I'm sorry, like there's all of the evidence is on that side. So I'm like, okay, what's the next level up? What's the non-systemic systemic intervention? It's where each individual person finds their niche, because then the entire system resolves spontaneously. And that's not masturbatory. As long as the people in the community use the slack that's provided in that community to find their niche and then actually implements that in the world. I am now, my community is 4 months old. I am trying to make sure that that's the case. But eventually you can't force people to do that. The idea is that you connect people in this community with a purpose line. You connect them with resources that allow them to either spend their money in a responsible way or to find a career that's more aligned with the attractor. I believe that once you align with the attractor, or at least upregulate in your life, things get better systemically and individually, because it has to. But the idea that somehow these communities are responsible for systemic interventions, the idea of an agentic group of people looking at systemic interventions fills me with dread.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Claudia, let's go with you.
Hey, Claudia.
Hi, Tom. Hi, Peter. We haven't met in person like this. Hi, everybody else. So I'm a little nervous talking in a group of bunch of men. I'm just going to say that just to get that off my chest. And next, say that I love your work, Tom. I think you're right on. I think working at the individual level is absolutely the first place to begin. What I'd like to encourage us to do, however, is bring it into relationship with others. So, if we look at love as the guiding kind of attractor, and I'm using the definition of love to be the process of knowing and being known, then we all carry these self-protection strategies that started early in life when we were in a very imperfect holding environment. And those self-protection strategies continue to interfere with our ability to really be with another. And that it includes our environment, our physical environment. So I'd love to see more situations in this liminal space, more groups where we are really starting to explore intimacy in relationship to one another. And those really require small groups of no more than 5. I'm experimenting with one that I affectionately call We for Wisdom Exchange, and John is in that group with me. Experiencing love. And we're a bunch of, I'm the only woman, we're a bunch of men, and it's really, it's quite interesting. And so I want to encourage something like that to start to flourish more in this space as an ability to make capitalism more humane if we all experience love more deeply with each other.
Yeah, oh yeah. And it's our biggest failure mode as a group, as you correctly identified, which is that, we had the Q&A this morning with Mona Sobhani, who did the 8th episode of my series, and a bunch of you were in that meeting, and there were tears, and she lost someone close to her recently, and then the whole community rallied around her very quickly to be like, here are our best resources on grief. It's in a WhatsApp, it's not the most intimate setting that there is, but I'm trying to work with what I've got. One of the things that I've been looking into, and that's something I'd like to talk to you about, and someone was talking to me last week about doing YPO style pods for IFS. That he's found that to be the most effective modality of anyone I know. And we've got Marcus Blacker, I see, just joined in, who's an expert on IFS as well. IFS seems to be something that works. Me as a complete ignorant newbie, it seems to be something that works. So maybe putting a small community of 5 to 6 people together and talking about IFS is the kind of loving container that makes these things resilient. I've been doing a lot of work on community over the last year, but the last few weeks in particular. One of the stats that came out of my interview with Brian Wetton was, when you're creating a container, 10% of the value comes from what comes out of my mouth, the person that forms the container. 30% of the container comes, the value of the container comes from like the therapeutic relationship that you created. And 60% of the value, in his opinion, comes from the commitment of the person coming to the container, the willingness to change. You know, he's like, I can read the phone book to someone, and if they really want to change, they will. The problem with that is that that commitment is often financial. You know, he charges an insane amount of money, right? Like, or that commitment is in terms of time. And one of the biggest problems that freaks me out about my community is that getting agentic people, and just to address something in the chat, I do think that agentic is often synonymous with left brain, for better and for worse, mostly for worse. Getting people to commit is one of the most interesting problems, because like, there is usually money they'll just like, oh fuck it, I paid $1,000 for that, but I don't matter because $1,000 isn't enough. Or for them to commit emotionally is very, very difficult. So what I've noticed is the most powerful people that I deal with, from like an old school powerful perspective, don't actually commit to things emotionally. And I don't know how to solve that problem, but it's something I'm going to be running into. So I'm grateful for you raising it, because it's probably the way that these communities fail when they deal with people who are quite quote unquote powerful. But powerful often goes hand in hand with being very disconnected and left hemispheric.
Any follow-up question or share, Claudia?
No, I just want to say that I'm really cheering you on, Tom. And so I'm really glad that you're doing this. You're definitely, pulling all the pieces together in a really cogent way, coherent way. And you obviously have people who are following you. And yeah, just let's talk about the relational aspect. I think that that's an important piece. And I do think that that is right brain and typically feminine in orientation, which is why I'm not surprised that there are only 2 of us women here on this call. But I'm hoping that I can interest the rest of you to look at this. So
I worry about this all the time. You know, look at this block of faces, right? But also, I don't worry about it, because I can only do what I can do, and as long as I'm not actively repressing or denigrating the feminine, which I don't think I do. The fact is that I'm going to make a gendered statement that I'm really sure about in my own anecdotal experience, which is that men's problem is that they get stuck in the wrong rabbit hole. And women's problem is that they get told to do everything by a society that doesn't understand how ludicrously overwhelming all these opportunities are, and that it's impossible to do everything. At least that's what's come up in all my coaching work of men and women over the last few years. So like, men get stuck in these rabbit holes, men get stuck in left brain lock, which is why like, I find that the people that come to me tend to have that problem, and that problem tends to have a relatively consistent solution. Everyone's life is different, but the pattern of that solution I'm noticing is relatively the same. So like, I wish there was a more feminine component to this, and thankfully, like, a lot of our practitioners are women in the group, and a lot of our members are women in the group. So like, more than average, but it's something that definitely I stress out about.
So, thanks, Claudia. Tom, do you have a hard stop at the top, or could you go a little bit?
No, I go, mate. Yeah.
Cool. John, you got a question?
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I enjoyed it a lot, and especially like the framing of following your niche. And as some sort of like spiritual and developmental kind of way of navigating through life. But there's this like underlying undercurrent of a feeling of like grimness when it comes to timing and pacing that I'm just like feeling in relation to what we call the metacrisis. And I'm curious about what your thoughts would be on like having like, how can our networks or these spaces become, like the network as a whole, become more agentic, such that our ability to respond to emergent complexifying crises can be like, so we have some sort of chance because it's just like when you one see like what's happening in certain areas and with the climate change and with the regional conflicts, it's like, yeah, there's like a sense of powerlessness. And then how there's like this question of like going from the scale of finding your niche and really just and allowing that attractor to really impact in the butterfly effect of like impacting one's life and local communities, to like the agentic possibility of like these networks to do something, to respond. That's just what's coming up for me.
I feel you, man. I feel the same thing. The answer I've come to, I don't know if you guys have ever read Intimations of a New Worldview by Brett Anderson. It's one of the better essays I've ever read. And he talks about the hero's journey as essentially being a metaphor for a phase change in a complex adaptive system. It's a lot of words, but all he's talking about in that is that there's dissonance in the system and people realize there's something wrong. And then the system encounters as an anomaly that destroys its world and turns it upside down. And then the system reconfigures to incorporate that anomaly and it emerges at a high level of complexity. So like, what does that mean? It means that there's something we don't have right. For me right now, I believe it's that like we've done this thing, capitalism, and it's been phenomenal, but it's basically just aggregated human intelligence. And there's this idea of a superior intelligence, which I call attractor intelligence, until someone comes up with a pithier term, that we need to surrender that amazing left hemispheric human agency to. We need to connect with something in relation. The rub is that implies through that model a breakdown, a dark night of the soul, a death and rebirth. Like, and I always like, does that mean a systemic societal death and rebirth? I'm like, I don't know. But what I'm going to do is provide a container, as much as I dislike that word, for people to go through that dissolution process safely, right? Like I can't hold people's hand. I can't force people through that process. No one can, but you can create a safe place for them to experiment with finding their niche within that container, which is why I believe these intermediary communities that bring slack into the system bring higher odds that you can pivot individual hyperagents without the system breaking down, because they do need to go through a death and rebirth. But I'm thinking about whether you can go through that death and rebirth smoothly. Like I had like a spiritual awakening experience that destroyed my view of reality in about 25 minutes, right? Like without substances. And it took me 7 years to put my brain back in the box. I'm hopeful, and part of the reason I do almost everything I do is that maybe naively I try and expose people to these ideas piecemeal so that they don't get ontological shock, and that I do it with as much science as possible so that people can start to incrementally trust their curiosity a little bit more, like just a little bit, just to understand that emotional sensation you have, which is calling you towards something like the call to adventure, which indicates something is wrong with your model, to have a little bit more confidence in that, because that will reduce their suffering. And hey, it's probably not going to save the world, but it might make it slightly better while it burns down.
All right. Alex, I'll take you in.
Hey guys, hey Tom. Yeah, so this is just kind of coming through me. I'll try to be brief because I don't even know if there's like a clear question. It's just kind of a bubbling up, which is kind of around this theme of community building, I guess, and like what makes, I don't know, the pitfalls there maybe. And I think it's definitely related to to your observations about commitment. And I'm just kind of thinking of this parallel between something about conflict, to the theme of conflict as being necessary for intimacy. So there's something there about kind of, and I think related to that is there's something, this sense of like also non-ordinary states of consciousness. So like a lot of times these dialogues happen in these ordinary states, whereas in my experience, like base reality, real relationships is just like weirder and messier maybe. And I think there's something about traversing that with people that creates deeper bonds or something. And I'm just thinking again, like it's not gonna be that cogent here, but like I'm thinking about my wife, just the amount of It's probably the richest, most beautiful relationship that I have. And if I think about the kind of states that we've moved through together, and there's certainly the commitment piece where you're like, we're in this, we're like locked in, so we're really going to navigate all these bumps. And then as you go through that progressively, like things become much richer and deeper and open. And I think a marriage is not a kind of, you're calling it an intermediary community. Like they're clearly different things. And I don't think you're trying to recreate that level of commitment necessarily. But yeah, it's kind of just occurring as like an interesting perspective, and like to as maybe someone who's holding these spaces. I know Diane Mushel Hamilton is known a lot for this like sameness and difference, and is quite skillful at evoking charge and tension in the group as a way of kind of alchemizing something or kind of creating something new. And as part of your community, I've not yet kind of seen that. And there's generally in communities this bias towards being polite, towards sameness, towards finding the positive things we agree on. And I think if there's a question I can close to, it's like, to what extent do you need the conflict, the weird states that are less civil for something more lasting, substantive to form?
Yeah. I have thought about this, but I'm not sure I have your answers yet. I'd say that, like, actually, if you go back to the Brett Anderson essay, he talks about how you need dissonance to create that friction that takes you to the next level. And the way that Brian Wetton put it to me in a line that I've been thinking about constantly for about 4 months is, you can only see as much in yourself as someone else can see in you. Essentially, he's like, my wife is the most intuitive person I've ever met in my entire life. She unconsciously sees my shadow, mirrors it back to me, and that triggers me, right? As I said earlier. So you suddenly get something reflected back to you that reflects something disowned or unpleasant about your own personality. That friction hopefully creates some sort of resolution, which maybe goes back to Claudia's point about maybe you need intimate IFS work to get this done. For me right now, given that like I'm still overcautious about people canceling 3 months into their first membership, right? Like I don't want to make it a deliberately uncomfortable place for people to be in. So the stance I've taken with highly intellectualized people like me is to confront them with different worldviews, like Mona Sobhani's work, Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, that's like, hey guys, maybe reality doesn't work quite the way you think it does. That's a lot for a lot of people, right? Like that's like ontological shock for a lot of people. And that's where I've started. But I think smaller, more intimate groups where there can be friction and conflict is good. I just know that the egos involved at the level of the people that I'm dealing with could not deal with a situation like this where they were being criticized. Many of them could. It's not fair, but a lot not. Like, why am I paying money to be a member of a community where I get called out in front of 8 people? Fuck that, Good question. Thank you.
So maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Victor, you had a question.
Hey, thank you. Good to see you again. So I don't know, trying to come at this question from a systems aware perspective and thinking of the kind of time frame that you're thinking about. I'm hearing you for wanting to facilitate like transformations of agentic people so that they can become activated and have effect in the world. I've met on my journey over the last 2 years many people who have like already like gone through a kind of phase transition, and I've seen published, like in the network I think that we kind of run in, say from Layman Pascal in particular, like an awareness that there's these kinds of people, and that many of them operate in scarcity because they've not found kind of a handhold in modern economy. You're talking to people who have, and you are trying to catalyze them. Do you think that it's a reasonable theory of change to want to activate the source of resources in support of people who may be further along their transformational journey and may be the question is something like that. I see this as a, proposed theory of change out there in this kind of network. I just wanted to bump it up against you and see if that passes your shit test, or like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, to go back to Walker, right? Like, I'm going to be pretty harsh here, but I've been a member of a bunch of spiritual communities where you have people with no executive function trying to change things. Like, you can't, the one criticism you can't make about like a former Wall Street managing director is that they have no executive function. They know how to get stuff done. They know how to reply to emails, right? Like, it's hugely positive in theory that those people flip, right? Like, there's a million different ways it can go wrong, and I'm seeing all of them right now, but it's hugely positive that these people flip. I don't really have a problem with that idea. You know, one of the things that Brian talked to me about, he's been at this for 23 years now. He's like, the number one determinant of whether someone's going to make it as a successful coach is the level of success, financial success they had before becoming a coach. Because frankly, it can take like 10 years. Most formally successful people, like I guess I would put myself in that category, as grim as that sounds, assume that once they hang up a coaching shingle, because they've just jumped through all the right hoops in their life, they're going to be immediately successful as a coach. And one, that's probably really dangerous if they're attracting very powerful people, but they haven't done the work on themselves. But two, it's just not true. You know, I hung up a shingle as a coach about 6 years ago and no one showed up. And why should they? I had no skills. I had nothing to do, right? So like, you have the one thing, which is like, yes, it's great that highly agentic people are flipping. No, it's not so great that they're pivoting immediately to coaching, when I'm not sure that that's where these people should end up. It's just the coaching industrial complex tends to co-opt those people. I see this more as a, and I have way less evidence for this, Victor, and it's really bothering me how little evidence I have for this. But like, I see this much more as, you go into this liminal space that I've created, and hopefully everyone else does too. They get a bunch of highly agentic people, and those people end up, there's someone in the group that's started a food company, that was a hedge fund manager and started a food company that's been phenomenally successful. And his entire shtick right now, currently going viral in front of the US Senate, is cleaning up the food industrial complex. So like, he's put that incredible weapon of war to bear against one of the central demons of our society. And like, he's still got the same agency, right? And he's still using the same skills. He's just using them in service of something that's fundamentally for the good. I wish I had more data points for that, but I think that's what this is about. And food was very, very specific to his origin story. Very, very specific, right? So he had the skills. He then hits at the top of Success Mountain, and then he pivoted those skills towards something that he really cared about, and now is doing a huge amount of good. That's the story I want to see. Maybe everyone's destiny is to become a coach. I don't know, but it just doesn't necessarily seem like the right move for a lot of these people, because it doesn't include the natural diversity.
Got you. So what I'm hearing back from you is that, like, one of the desire paths, from here, towards the holotropic attractor that you see people following is like going from, the before times to like becoming a coach. What I'm expressing is that, like, so, and what I'm hearing is you're saying that, like, okay, take the existing like executive functioning skills, market awareness, like winning at capitalism, but oriented towards like solutions that are more directly aligned with pro-social aims.
Yeah.
Got you.
Blimey, right, that isn't going to be like incredibly problematic on every level, but is it better than we currently have? Yes, probably.
Fair. Understood. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
And John Ogden, just I saw you come up in the chat. Check out Dave Nadig for the zines. Guy's a good friend of mine. He's a member of our community, and he is zine obsessed. Sorry for that programming break, Peter.
Well, I think we have one more question. Grant, I don't know if your question is still alive for you, but we can close with yours.
Thanks, Peter. Tom, I built a coaching company 12 years ago, so this makes me laugh a lot, this commentary around everyone going through coaching. I happen to build a coffee company in Australia as well, so I'm not guilty of only doing coaching. It's great that there's a follow-up. I'm going to open with a really weird one. I actually think that curiosity's got nothing to do with being interested. I think they're actually biologically different pathways. And I've done thousands of whiteboards. So, as coaching and whiteboarding and all that, you start to see the unconscious mind, subconscious patterns. And I've seen a lot of evidence that curiosity is pointing towards novelty in the attractor sense. And being interested in things is going deeper into patterns, is like following a different kind of attractor. They look like two different attractors to me. That's the question.
What's the difference between them? Super interesting, thank you.
Being interested sustains, being curious doesn't. Curiosity is very short burn. It doesn't last long. Being interested lasts and lasts and lasts. You can follow it for years. Curiosity is really, really quick. So it's novelty seeking.
Would this be a resolution? So like, it's like explore, exploit algorithm, right? That like, when you're in the wrong niche, you put your head up and you use your right hemisphere to look around and you see something and then you exploit using your left hemisphere. So is the curious what reorients you, which is why it's short-lived, and then interest is what mines the niche. It's something I think about a lot, and I'm not sure it's right, but maybe it's a reconciliation for you.
Yeah, I was just curious if that is a distinction that you've played with or that makes sense to you. Because I'm really interested in people who've done a lot of deep work about this sort of stuff. What is interesting, fundamentally. I felt like the world was alive since I was a little kid, and I love this ontological shock. I've never heard that before, and I've been through a few of those. This capitalism comment that you make, I really agree with. And the next capitalism looks like pretty advanced AI and AI coaches and all these sorts of things are going to happen. I talked to Viveki in London once upon a time, and I said to him, well, you're talking about all these sage AIs and all these sorts of things. What's your comment around AI and like the wisdom economy around AI? Is there such a thing as the wisdom economy? Is there such a thing as wisdom AIs? Is that a class of form of AI that's valuable, or do you mock that like with your anti-utopianism?
Scares the shit out of me for a bunch of different reasons, mainly because of the people in control of AI. But the coolest thing I've ever seen on this topic, I wrote an article about it for the second part of my series called Revealing Attractors. It took me 6 months to write, so I'm quite proud of it. It's only 9 minutes to read. But there's a dude called Ken Stanley who had something called Pick Breeder that you can go and check out like right now. And all it is this really lo-fi grid of pictures. And what you do is you click one that's interesting to you and you click mutate, interesting, see? And you click mutate, and then it does variants on that picture. And then you click mutate again when you click the most interesting one. So all you're doing is clicking the most interesting picture at every individual moment and then clicking mutate. They found that in a really short space of time, those photos would turn into something recognizable. They'd go from abstract to a butterfly, to a skull, to a race car, to a penguin, far faster than happened that if the computer just did it at random, right? And then if they said to people, you should turn this abstract picture into a butterfly, they couldn't do it with an infinite number of tries, right? So the implication that Stanley took away from it was that novelty has to be pursued one step at a time. And once the human aspect of novelty, the unique human ability to seek novelty is put into the system, it creates beauty. Like literally beauty. And it makes me think about our evolutionary role as novelty engines, as beauty engines. The bit which I bring up occasionally in AI discussions, which, like, to be quite honest, scrambles a lot of people's brains, is the idea that we experience novelty predominantly through our heart. It is an electromagnetic impulse. It is energetic. That our hearts somehow situate us towards truth and novelty and beauty in our environment. And I'm like, AI doesn't have a heart. It can't tell what's relevant with infinite context, right? Like if you type into ChatGPT, what is my niche? It will not be able to help you in the way that your heart can. It will not be able to help you in the way that the attractor intelligence can, because it is fundamentally not connected to those things. Now, it would be equally stupid to say that it's not a useful tool. I use it all the time for a whole bunch of different things. I use it mostly to automate my left hemisphere, and I think it's going to be great if the dynamic, the archetypal dynamic of it always being under control of the right hemisphere, right? We are the prompt. And if we stop being the prompt, yeah, bad.
So the heart sensitivity is really fundamental here.
Yeah, I've written a long piece about that. And it's all like anecdotal, but every other human culture talking about the role of the heart in truth, pathfinding, novelty, beauty, relation, love. If love is the attractor.
I agree with all of that. And just last comment around that. I think in the next few years, if there are machines that can show us what our electromagnetic coherence is between heart and mind and all the biofeedback things. I got plugged into some things like 16 years ago. It was a heart maths guys. They can do proper biofeedback on coherence of the heart. You can literally see that. So the next level of like heart's coherence, the machines won't have hearts, but they could show us how to do that. Is that something that's relevant here to the attractor theory? Like, could that be a pathway of proof?
Yeah, and I think about the idea of using technology to downregulate the left hemisphere.
Yep.
It actually implicitly upregulates the heart because the heart is dramatically more connected to the right hemisphere, right? Like the role of technology in this is not clear. Randy's on the call and he's forgotten more about this than I'll ever know. But like this shit here that's really exciting that's going to be using technology. And I've met the Earth Elders, several of them, and they're like, we were supposed to fall, right? This prodigal relationship was supposed to happen. If you read, I really recommend you guys read the last 4 pages of Rick Tarnas's epilogue of The Passion of the Western Mind. It's free online. And he's just like, this was a necessary departure because then we went away and we got all these ridiculously cool stuff. And the question is, can we bring the really cool stuff back under the control of the right hemisphere, back under the control of the heart quickly enough? Because if we can't, we're all doomed. But we still needed to go out and get the stuff. And so like, I'm not negative on tech. I'm just like, do you think the majority of people in the valley are left brain locked and operating from a place of love? You'd be a crazy person to answer yes to that question.
Well, I've talked to a lot of the AI scientists and I find them deeply unethical, but that's just a side comment. So I'll leave it there.
No, it's not. It's not a side comment. That's not a side comment. That's the comment. Right.
Yeah, it's freaky. Anyway,
Yeah.
Thanks for your work, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah. Thanks for asking me that question. I'm going to be thinking about it for a weirdly long period of time.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Grant. So we'll gently close here. I guess the last question, Tom, is about the leading edge. Anything you would like to share about this group? If people are interested, how they can look up more about it?
www.theleading-edge.org. All my content's free, and the membership is currently like soft closed, but if anyone here is drawn to it, let me know. I'm only taking people on referral just because the quality of the group has been so high that I'm not willing to take on too many randos and risk poisoning the well. So it's been really, really powerful. It's been an incredible endorsement of the fact that it works. To people listening that are interested in it, I would say go start your own. These things work. And I think that the more agentic people we can get into these kind of communities, it makes our lives better. Like it's been really fun, I think, for a lot of the people who are in the community. And so it's been a net positive for them. So yeah, go check out my work, but go bother me on Twitter. I've never turned down a meeting with anyone. So jump in my DMs and we'll get together. Thanks for having me, Peter.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for coming, Tom. It was an awesome session. Excited about your work. I'm going to read through the rest of the series, and I'll put the links on the video description if you're watching on YouTube. So yeah, Tom, everyone, thanks so much for coming to Stoa today.
Thanks, guys.